Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the video webinar series that is hosted by the Ball State University's Center for Professional Sales. My name is Deva Rangarajan and I am the Director of the Sales Center. And today, like usual, we have a star in our midst. So we're going to have Seleste Lunsford, who is the Chief Research Officer at CSO Insights, which is part of the Miller-Hyman Group. And she's going to share with us some valuable insights about a key topic that a lot of sales managers today have to deal with. That is, how do we try to get the right kind of talent, how do we onboard them, and how do we make them productive members of the sales force. And again, we are privileged to have Seleste, and this is in following up with Tamara Schenk, who's a colleague of Seleste, who does a lot of work on sales enablement. But of course, the sales enablement is likely to work if you have the right kind of talents on board. So Seleste, thank you so much for taking time off your busy schedule to talk to our audience.
Thanks for having me.
Indeed. Seleste, so one of the things I think you are privileged to is the fact that as Chief Research Officer, you get a chance to have a finger on the pulse of what a lot of sales directors and sales managers and senior salespeople talk about. And that, I guess, was the reason why you came up with your sales talent study. So can you give us a little bit more insights about what this talent study is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do several studies each year, and some of them we do every year, and that way we can see trends. And one of the things that kept popping up over the last 18 months was the fact that sales leaders, CROs, CSOs, executive directors, were starting to become a lot more concerned about their talent. So that prompted us to devote an entire study just to sales talent to understand where did that concern come from and what were they doing about it.
It's fantastic, because one of the things we talk about in sales enablement is, of course, onboarding of talent and everything else, but that assumes that you have the right talent to work with. So this yearly, at least this special study that you talk about, right? Now, when you started doing this, what were, in your opinion, some of the key findings? And we can delve into this as well. So in your opinion, what are some of the key findings that you think managers should be worried about?
It's a great question. So when we look at what B2B buyers in particular are doing differently, what they're telling us is they're starting to squeeze salespeople out of the sales process. And one of the questions we had is, do senior sales executives, do they see the same thing? Yeah. And what we found is that 84% of these senior leaders we talked to did not believe the sales talent they had today was the talent was going to take them into the future and could help them be successful in the future.
Wow. So, so when you talk about sales talent now, are you talking about youngsters coming into the workforce? Are you talking about existing salespeople who have been great when things were working in the previous way of working? Are you talking about that 84% including new talents or also existing salespeople?
Great question. I'm talking about the incumbent sales force, which is generally in most sales organizations a mix of people who are new to sales as well as people who have been sales their entire career. And if you look at an onboarding class today, it's going to have people from all kinds of different backgrounds and generations in it, because people in sales roles, not all of them want to be sales leaders. They tend to stay in a sales role. And so we were talking to sales leaders. It wasn't about, the next people you're seeing come into entry-level positions. It was about the full pool of sales talent they had today.
And do you think that when you talk about sales talent, it's also sales talent by function? You know what I mean? Let's say, for example, SDRs, BDRs, right? The sales development reps. So when you talk about sales talent, is it sales talent for one particular kind of function, or it's across the many functions that you find in any sales organization?
It's across the functions, because what you're finding is all of these roles in sales organizations are becoming a lot more specialized. Yeah. And as they, so the SDR function, the customer success function. So as these roles become more specialized, the requirements for them become more sophisticated and more experience oriented.
Indeed. So you talk about 84%. In your opinion, that's the numbers that the sales directors and CROs and CSOs, in case CRO would stand for the Chief Revenue Officer, in case for the participants looking at this as well. So if you take a look at this 84%, but in your opinion, is this really the right number? Or if I ask you from your gut feel, from your talking to other people as well, do you think that 84% truly reflects the problem? Or you know what I mean? That is it something that the problem is exaggerated, given the fact that there's a lot of issues and you can always blame something else rather than the fault of the sales manager themselves?
Right. So I do think it's validated. And the reason why is in a separate study, we worked with about 500 B2B buyers and we asked them where they went to if they had a business problem. So what do you consider a resource for a business problem? And we gave them a list of 10 to 12 things. And we said you could pick up to 3. Well, they picked salespeople next to last. And so less than a quarter of these buyers said, I really view my salesperson as someone who can help me solve a business problem. So if you've got CROs and CSOs who are skeptical, they have the talent of the future. On the other hand, you have buyers who are saying, I don't mind my salespeople. I don't dislike them. I don't really see them as someone who's going to help me solve a business problem. Then that feels about the same magnitude.
Wow. So again, as a faculty member who's trying to train youngsters, these kind of numbers are actually sobering, right? Is the fact that if B2B buyers, the whole purpose of why we have these sales centers is to try and make sure that we train our salespeople to be relevant, to be creating value for our customers, especially in the B2B case. But if salespersons are being seen as almost a second to last, the penultimate person or so resource for people to be looking at for gaining information, that is pretty staggering. So what do you think are some of the key challenges that organizations face when it comes to this talent management? So sure, talent management is a problem. So where are some of the issues that they're encountering to get these talents?
It's a great question. So I think attrition is an accepted part of sales. You would accept a certain amount of attrition in the sales world. The challenge is that there's not necessarily a strategic approach to how you manage that attrition in an appropriate way. So right now, the labor market is pretty positive, and it is hard for people to find salespeople. They have lots of choices. And so what the study found is on average, it takes about 4 months to fill a sales position. And then it takes about 9 months before that person is at the productivity level of someone who is experienced. So that's almost a year, slightly over a year. It's a full quota year where you've got a territory that's not necessarily operating at its best productivity. At the same time, you've got sales, so the gaps are hard to fill. The second issue is people aren't necessarily sure what they want to fill the gaps with. So right now, about the top 20% of your sales force produces somewhere around 50 to 55% of your revenues. That's pretty standard. However, very few organizations understand why those top performers are so successful and others aren't. So they actually haven't done the science to understand what profile is most successful in their world and what of that is a hiring attribute versus something that you can train. And so what happens then is you've got a whole bunch of people who are trying to get jobs filled. It's very hard right now to get those jobs filled. Meanwhile, you've got territories sitting open. So you have a lot of people making hiring decisions based on gut or what they personally knew in the past. They're not necessarily future pacing who they're bringing into the organization.
Fantastic. Now I'm going to break down what you said into many questions as well. So, sub questions. The first one is the attrition part, right? Now, when you talk about attrition, are you talking about forced attrition or are you talking about natural attrition? Because that could be two different things, right? Forced attrition is where you want to downsource or downsize or you want to let go of people. Are you talking about attrition in that viewpoint or are you talking about attrition from the viewpoint of natural attrition?
We look at both. So we look at both voluntary and involuntary attrition. And typically voluntary attrition in the sales world is going to be a little bit higher than involuntary, but both represent problems for a sales organization. So when you look at voluntary attrition, what you're finding is your job, for whatever reason, does not match up to other jobs in the marketplace. Perhaps it's not competitively benched. Perhaps it's not an engaging culture. People are finding better opportunities elsewhere. The problem we find with involuntary attrition is it usually takes too long. And so because there's not a really good formal coaching structure in place, it's a little more informal how people do performance and development, those sorts of things. They will leave a salesperson who's being unproductive in a role for much longer than they should. And sometimes that involuntary attrition is even more damaging because you've got a lot of underperforming territories.
Now, sticking to attrition, because one of the things that I've always had is frustration. So when we go do these trainings and we have these frustrations from potential customers who claim that they understand that there's attrition and attrition is going to be voluntary as well as involuntary, but what they feel is that they do not know when this happens how they're going to be treated. Because for me, that is one of those things that is it a sales talent problem? I do not know, but eventually all of us in the sales organization are responsible for creating value. So to what extent do you think that there is a focus on talent in the viewpoint of taking care of our attrition and how to manage it, but do you think that companies are letting the guard down in terms of understanding the possibility for your competition to come in at that point in time and say how they deliver better value? Am I making sense out here? Because we tend to forget about the customer when the attrition takes place. So for example, I'll give you an example. So I fire somebody, but I do not necessarily keep my customer informed. Or my customer starts saying, you know what, you're going to bring somebody in new, and I have to actually coach this new person about what is so unique about us as a customer. So when we talk about hiring strategies here with the idea of keeping and delivering value for the customers, how many of these companies and sales managers that you talk to actually also keep in mind whether we are doing right by the customers?
I think they do a fairly good job of thinking about the customers in terms of hiring someone who's going to be a good fit for their customer base. I think where they struggle is they don't necessarily anticipate attrition.
Yeah. Okay.
And a lot of their accounts are what we call single threaded, which means that there's one person who's the face of the company in the customer. So if that person leaves voluntary, involuntary, let's say they got sick and had to take a leave, then that transition can be very awkward because there aren't other people in the organization who've been engaged. So part of being a good salesperson is bringing in others into the organization. You know, your finance guy can talk to their finance guy. Your IT expert can talk to their IT expert. And when you start to create multiple relationships, it's a better client experience, but it also hedges you against some of those things if you had a salesperson who left for whatever reason.
Yeah. Now, so going back, so we talked about attrition, but the next thing is you talked about this concept of we should know whom to hire, right?
Right.
Which means that we should have some sort of a hiring strategy in place, right?
Right.
Now, how many of the companies that you have a chance to work with have a very clear hiring strategy in place? Now, I'm not talking about what they're going to do after they hire, but at least hiring and onboarding them. So what are your experiences in that?
Yeah, I would say less than half, unfortunately. So hiring, because there's a certain amount of desperation right now in the market, in the sense that I have these open jobs. Every day that goes by, I don't have someone managing this territory. And you've got sales leaders who tend to work on gut a lot of times. They work on, I know who's going to be successful. I can have a couple of interviews with this person and I can just tell they're going to be successful. And if they're not embedding the science of assessments, of having a database profile, then they end up with lots of people who are just slightly less than optimal. So what I find is that from an HR perspective, they're very formal to make sure that jobs are not discriminatory in any way, that they're making sure that they're, doing a proper job of understanding the resource pool. But once you get into that interviewing through offer process, it tends to be a lot more subjective.
Fantastic. And what about onboarding? How many of the companies actually take onboarding seriously? When I mean onboarding, I'm not talking about, okay, I'm going to give you a week of these are our standard policies, these are our products, but actually taking it seriously, trying to make sure that people get embedded in the way this organization works.
It's a great question. It's somewhere around a third. A lot of organizations, as you mentioned, they think of onboarding as one short experience. I'm going to send you to headquarters for 2 weeks, and I'm going to give you every product knowledge presentation we can come up with. And at the end of that, I'll consider you ready to go out in the field. And I hope that your manager is going to pick up where I leave off, but we don't necessarily have a formal way of doing that. Organizations who do it right, they look at their data and they say, hey, my voluntary attrition usually happens somewhere around the 4 to 5 month mark. So I need to make sure that whatever my onboarding process is, that there's some touch points that carry through that period of time. And I need to give my managers a playbook so they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing at all these different points in time. And we're checking in. And therefore, onboarding becomes a phase of someone's career, not necessarily a 2-week experience or some sort of short product knowledge experience.
And I love this because one of the things that when you think of onboarding, the assumption when I talk to managers is that they just think of young recruits, but they don't think about people coming into their organization as well who come from a different way of working and everything else. So am I right in saying that onboarding is not just for new recruits, but for people in different stages in their career, for lateral hires and everybody else as well?
Absolutely. Most salespeople don't want to be sales managers because they would take a pay cut and they would work more hours. Most salespeople are quite happy to stay in sales roles. And if they don't have the opportunity to grow in their current company, they move to a different company. Yeah. And so any onboarding class, you are just as likely to see baby boomers as Gen X as millennials. And just because someone has experience in your industry doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful in your sales culture or working with your clients or demonstrating your value proposition. So they need onboarding just as much as anybody who has less experience.
Fantastic. And in your experience, to what extent do you think the companies that you're working with actually look at these different kinds of salespeople coming in and different onboarding experiences? Because I worked with one company where they said anybody new coming in, does not matter if they're young, they're experienced, they get the same kind of onboarding. They have this 30, 60, 90-day onboarding stuff, but unfortunately, everybody gets the same story, whereas people coming in at different levels might need different levels of, you know what I mean, onboarding, about how this company works and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on that one?
To me, I think where the importance is in the variety is more if you're doing those kind of hiring assessments, you can evaluate the people that come in and the way that they learn and the way that they need to be coached. So it's a little less about, hey, I took this person from in industry and maybe they need less product knowledge, which is a fair thing. It's how does this person going to be the most successful? And how do I set him or her up for success with his or her new boss to make sure that they have a way of co-developing each other? So a lot of times it's those intangibles that are more important to think about when it comes to the differences in your new hires versus just strictly, hey, they came from a competitor or they're from industry, so they just need a little bit.
Indeed. So that's fantastic. So essentially what you're saying is that you take them in, you do the assessment right, you understand where their strengths, where their weaknesses are, and come up with the right kind of content, the right kind of way of onboarding them as well, which brings the next point, which is you need to make sure that your sales managers, okay, if you're recruiting a sales manager, a sales director, should be able to coach them. And you hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about coaching. And to what extent do you think that, again, the companies that you had a chance to work with, have done the research with, how trained are the salespeople to do the right kind of coaching?
That's one that does depress me, in fact. So we just got in one of our most recent studies, and what we found was 60% of sales organizations still either leave coaching up to the manager or they have a very informal process, which means they might put someone through a sales coaching course, but they don't really reinforce it or follow up. And I think it comes from a place of feeling confident in sales leadership, and it comes from a place of complacency. So most organizations have historically not been really rigorous about sales coaching, and most of your managers and your directors grew up in that environment, and they learned to succeed. And so they just have gotten used to that. And so because of that, you find that still in most organizations, 60% coaching is a big gap.
And given all the changes that we find today in the business place, to what extent do you think that in most of these organizations that they have the right kind of competency profiles to look at even sales managers? Because if we start saying that there's going to be 6.8 people in the customer's decision-making unit, everybody is going to be more informed. We need a different way of managing the people, but the question still is, we still have practices like the best salespeople go on to become sales managers. I'm not saying that it's as bad as it was before, but we still have that kind of approach. Companies need to rethink their sales strategy, their sales approach, which has an impact on who goes on to become a sales manager and what they coach. And for me, is that goes into competency development, that goes into even looking at your sales strategy and aligning it with your corporate strategy. Does it happen? Because I still find that there's not enough people in the boardrooms of companies who are in sales professions.
It's a good question. One of the studies that we're about to put out in the next 60 days looks at what differentiates top performing organizations from their peers. And one of the things that was interesting to us that popped as a top practice was this idea that our culture supports ongoing development. And so I would say most organizations do have a competency model for managers, and they have a competency model for salespeople, and perhaps one for SDRs, et cetera. But they use that maybe they use it for hiring. They rarely use it for ongoing development. And so sales we're predisposed to action if we're in sales. And there's less time spent in developing an individual to make them a better seller, and a lot more time spent on, let me help you strategize this account, or let's review your funnel together. So because of that, I think people don't necessarily get a lot better at those competencies after they're hired. They may get some training, but once they're out in the field, they may not get any more training. They may not get any more development, and they'll certainly learn by doing, but it's a slow, gradual process. And so I don't know that they go back as frequently as they should and check against the competency model to say, hey, is Seleste developing, and these competencies were an opportunity for her.
And I love the fact that you said we are predisposed to action, but we are also the function that is most kind of exposed to change in the way the customers behave, and how our processes need to be rethought. And with technology advancing so much, that we need to be rethinking our sales processes, which means that the way we coach them, which means that the skill sets of our sales managers. I mean, that's my opinion, so I do not know what your thoughts on that one are. But I think I love the fact that when you say predisposed to action, but we're also exposed to a lot of change. And as frontline employees, we feel the brunt of all the changes. And if our managers are not up to speed on the ways of trying to manage people, it becomes very, very hard. Now, one of the things we talk about is the fact that you said that around a lot of people in terms of onboarding them, we need to make sure we need to take a look at what is their previous functionalities and where they come from and everything else. What about the ability for people to grasp? Because that's one of the things which in the past we would put everybody through the same kind of stuff, assuming that everybody learns the same way. Is that something that you're beginning to see as well? Is that understanding the learning profiles of the people, how they like to learn, things like that happening as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So some organizations have been using hiring assessments for some time, and some actually have been, recalibrating. So the key is, if you have a hiring assessment, you actually have to use it, and you have to recalibrate it over time. Because to your point, this all hinges on the customer, and we know customers are changing. And as the customer changes, so must the sales process, and therefore the talent that you need to execute on the sales process. And one of the changes that we're seeing is that, maybe 6-7 years ago, in those hiring profiles, the attributes that were the most heavily weighted were things around emotional intelligence, or EQ. Yeah. So does Seleste have relating skills? Is she good at influencing people? Can she communicate to people in different ways? Those are still important, but those are much less differentiating. And what we find is the competencies and the attributes and the traits that tend to be more common in profiles now are things like intellectual curiosity, learning agility, the ability to use analytical skills. We did a study recently and looked at the majors of people who were entering into sales for the first time. And as you'd expect, number one is business, with a growing number of people with a sales degree. But number two is STEM. And I think the reason why is that more and more of these profiles are looking for people who have those analytical skills and can take the data and the insights that come from all of these new tools and then quickly move to action with them.
Now, it's interesting because on the one hand, it looks like we need to be looking at data and everything else. I'm not saying that data is not going to help you be creative, because one of the things we also hear is that an organization that I worked with was very interesting, was getting their salespeople to go into art classes, art appreciation, looking at creative ways. And I'm not saying that that's not related to data, but to what extent should I draw that kind of a fine line between analytics at the same time letting them be creative? In terms of, okay, because customers now have very, very strange, innovative questions or problems that you cannot solve with traditional ways. So what are your thoughts on that one?
One of the things that learning agility applies to is not just, can I learn new things that my sales organization gives me, but can I learn things from my customers, and how do I react to that? Yeah. And so where you see that creativity and innovation plan is, can I quickly take all this data that's being dumped on me, and can I turn it into insights? So rather than swimming in this data until I'm overwhelmed by it, how can I quickly pull some insights to it? And then say, okay, from these insights, how might I solve this customer's problem? And then I'll worry afterwards how close or far that is from a package solution, or geez, how will I price that? But first, let me think through, what do I know about them? What do I know about us? And then what is the right way to solve this particular problem? Then I start to sell internally and negotiate. So that creativity really comes into play when it comes to configuring a unique solution, or figuring out how to manage a bunch of relationships in an existing account.
For me, that is very, very interesting when I'm looking for somebody new. But most organizations have an existing sales force that might not have the same new way of being creative with data and stuff like that. So what can organizations do to try and make sure that the people, again, you're going to have a mix of young people, well, I hate to say the word young, creative people as well as non-creative people, but you need to make sure that you need to have everybody in there. You cannot just fire or let go of somebody. So how would you take a look at the talents that you have who are not necessarily cut out for the new way of doing business? And how would you try to make sure that they are also successful?
It's a great question. One of the things that we uncovered is attrition right now is running in the 16 to 18% range, including both voluntary and involuntary. And most sales organizations are trying to grow net another 9 to 10% because economies are good right now and they're trying to increase their coverage. So you actually could change the space of your sales organization just organically in a couple of years if you were hiring to profiles that were going to future pace the organization. So one thing would be, no, we would never recommend that a sales organization disrupt their whole customer base by just firing all their salespeople and starting over. But organically, you probably have a bigger opportunity to change the face of your sales organization than you think. The second thing would be to think about role specialization. Most organizations are going through this process of specializing roles. The question becomes, if you have a successful profile of salesperson and that is working well with your customer base, but you need to infuse some more creativity around the configuring the solutions, do you need a solution architect who might be an overlay position who could help with that?
So it actually then becomes a whole sales organization, which becomes a sales strategy. It's very, very interesting that if we talk about this as the roles and everything else, and people who were not thought of as sales before now suddenly become part of sales. And of course, let's not talk about the fact that whether they like to be called as salespeople or not, hence the terms like solution architects. Now, I know that there are so many questions that I have, but I'm going to try to trim it down to 2 or 3 more. And I'm going to ask you and put you on a spot and say, based on what you've seen so far, can you identify 3 great initiatives that organizations have taken? It could be from a variety of industries. 3 positive things that you've seen in terms of talent management, and also 3 missteps. Let's begin with the 3 positive things you've seen.
Okay, so I'll start with the positives. The first, I think, is talking about talent as a strategic initiative. So organizations that are the most successful view talent as something the CRO or the CSO has to worry about. And organizations that are less successful, HR handles that, and sales really manages the volume. Here's the number of positions we need. So successful organizations, a CSO or a CRO is going to have a compensation strategy. They're going to have a coverage model. Well, they also have a talent strategy that thinks through exactly some of the things we're talking about. And it's the CRO who raises their hand and say, I want to own it. Now, obviously, HR is going to be involved and IT will be involved, but I'm going to own it. The second thing, I think, is this whole idea of adding science into talent. Talent, by its definition, can feel a little squishy. And there's lots of attributes that are intangible that you can't train to. And there's lots of competencies that you can. And so because of that, I think talent gets swept under this idea that it's, well, I know it if I see it, and I have a good gut feeling about it. So it's being able to resist that urge and saying, let's have a database profile for what talent looks like. And then I think the last thing is thinking through the end-to-end process. A lot of investment and concern gets devoted to, am I hiring the right people and am I onboarding them? And then the amount of concern after that point drops dramatically. So thinking through the whole thing, all the way through, are they getting coached? Are they getting developed? Hey, if they don't want to be sales managers, how would I engage them and how could I grow them? And let me ask myself honestly, are they a better salesperson than they were when they started? Not are they better at selling my stuff, better at understanding my products, but are they actually a better seller in their career? And if I do have to offboard someone, or if they leave voluntarily, am I doing that in a way that leaves the customers in a good place, that leaves their colleagues in a good place? And so it's looking at that whole thing end to end and not just hiring.
Fantastic. So these are some 3 positive things. What about the missteps that you have seen companies do?
Got it. So the first, of course, is just the having an assessment and not using it. So one of the questions that we asked in the study is, do you have a hiring assessment? But we asked, do you have a hiring assessment and you use it? Do you have a hiring assessment and you don't use it, or do you not have one at all? And interestingly, the group that did the worst were people who had a hiring assessment, but they didn't consistently use it.
Yeah.
And I think that they did worse because there was a false sense of security of, hey, we've done that. We've got one of those things, but they weren't actually consistently using it. They weren't calibrating it. It wasn't a key part of the onboarding or recruiting process. It was just a tool that HR had bought.
Yeah.
So that was one for sure. Another one would be I think I mentioned it earlier, the lack of ongoing enablement and ongoing development at that competency level. Most organizations, they have a big burst of energy around the beginning, and then it sort of tailors off and it becomes solely focused on a person's manager. And everybody knows that management is overstressed, doesn't have enough time, right now, an average sales manager spends twice as much time on internal activities than they do coaching. Yeah. So having that be the key point to your development, you're not setting yourself up for success.
Wow.
And then I think the last part that I think organizations get wrong, the third thing, is not figuring out roles and responsibilities. And so if you're hiring to all these attributes around learning agility and intellectual curiosity, are you putting enough opportunities directly in front of the reps that they can develop themselves? So understanding the different roles of individuals and peers, and not just sales leaders as a coach.
Fantastic. I think one of the things I'm sure that there are plenty of missteps and also good things as well. And one of the things which I find very important is for talent management is the sales coaching, which is what you also mentioned. That at the end of the day, it's great to do all this, but then if your managers are not able to, or your directors, whatever you want to call them, your direct supervisors are not able to coach you the right way, which is what you said, if they're focusing too much on other things, that for me was very, very interesting. Now, my one last question to you, Seleste, is what can universities and sales centers like us do to make sure that we are putting out the right kind of talent out there? What should we be doing right to make sure that our students who go on fresh into the workforce, what can we do to make sure that they're very successful very quickly?
It's a great question. To me, it's all about the way that they approach problem solving and the way that they approach selling, because the specific tools we know are going to change. And so where I see struggles in an organization is people might be familiar with one CRM and then they move in another, and the disruption is enormous because people got used to the tool, but not necessarily the opportunity management process underneath. So it's understanding the methodologies for how to sell and how to build customer relationships. And hey, great, if there's activity management tools, or there's outreach tools, or there's CRM tools, or lead scoring tools, all that stuff makes me more effective, but I still understand why. It makes me much more efficient as well, but I still understand what the underlying approach is, so I can apply that anywhere. And that kind of agility is helpful because sales organizations, they change all the time. And if people are too fixated on specific steps or specific tools, it's just hard for them to manage change. And right now, change is just raining down on salespeople from all the departments in a company.
Absolutely.
And it can be really distracting.
Indeed. And I guess that's also one of the things that we face as a challenge as well, is that we hear questions saying, all of this is great. Are we even going to have sales in the future? Artificial intelligence is coming out there. It's going to make sales redundant. I have some MBA students who come and say, well, is the role of the sales manager going to become redundant if AI is going to come out and say, hey, you need to be doing this, do the coaching for the sales managers? And essentially, that's pretty much is the challenge that we face, is how do we create those future-proof salespeople that you talk about that can go into organizations and be great talents immediately. I mean, of course, it takes them some time. That's pretty much what we're looking at. But anyway, Seleste, thank you indeed. So thank you so much for your time. And for the audience, again, I strongly recommend you to go take a look at CSO Insights. They have some great stuff happening out there. And if you're lucky enough, you can even get access to the reports. And I think the reports, the one on sales talents, is something that I personally learned a lot looking at it. It kind of reiterates what I've always felt, known, but it's great to also see it validated. And that's what CSO Insights does, is that it takes gut feel and tries to measure it and try to make sure that it's backed by actual facts, figures, and numbers, kind of what salespeople should be doing anyway. So Seleste, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing more great stuff that CSO Insights is doing as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.